everyone, welcome to our briefing. This briefing is being presented by WorldAware. WorldAware provides intelligence-driven, integrated risk management solutions that enable organizations to operate globally with confidence. WorldAware's end-to-end tailored solutions, integrated world-class threat intelligence, innovative technology, and response services help organizations mitigate risk and protect their people, assets, and brand reputation. Our first speaker is Brendan O'Reilly. Brendan has spent most of his adult life living and working in China, India, and New Zealand. His main areas of expertise are China's foreign policy and its domestic socio-political dynamics. Brendan is going to discuss how regional governments have responded so far and the outlook for recovery in the region. Brendan?
Thank you, Mary. Before we move on to talk about specific government approaches in different APAC countries, I'd like to briefly give an overview of the 4 COVID-19 response scenarios that WorldAware has come up with. These are general scenarios that show how different national governments are approaching the crisis. In the health first model, governments generally prioritize public health over normal business activity. This essentially boils down to a lives over livelihood dynamic, wherein there are tight controls and restrictions that prompt significant business disruptions, but that prevent a systemic public health collapse. In the second scenario, we have incremental normalization, which basically means that the governments are slowly rolling back their health restrictions in order to help promote normal resumption of economic activity, likely to have some degree of business impacts. The next model is one of business first. This is essentially governments quickly rolling back or not implementing sufficient restrictions in order to control their outbreaks. Now, this might have some less impact in terms of business operations. However, this approach could also lead to bad public health outcomes, possible political problems, which would then have secondary and tertiary business impacts. Finally, under the no normalization model, the government keeps its tight restrictions in place because there are public health emergencies which basically cause more long-term systemic issues and negatively impact the business environment. Moving on to look at China's response specifically. Now, obviously, China was the first country to be impacted by the COVID-19 outbreak, and we can broadly define China's current dynamic as one of incremental normalization, wherein controls are gradually being restricted. Obviously, China imposed some very, very tight controls near the beginning of its outbreak, especially in Wuhan and other areas of Hubei province. Wuhan, which is a large city, I want to say it's the 5th or 6th largest Chinese city in terms of population, was effectively sealed off from the rest of the world from late January until April 8th, at which point movement restrictions were eased. There were, of course, also control measures implemented to varying degrees throughout China, which again have largely been lifted in recent weeks. That being said, there have been situations in which Chinese authorities have introduced new control measures at the local level in response to localized outbreaks of COVID-19. You can see on the map there, the dot in central China is Jia County, Henan province. In the northeast, we are highlighting Harbin, the capital of Heilongjiang province, and Suifenhe, which is a town on the Russian border. All three of these locations within recent weeks have reported fairly significant outbreaks by current Chinese standards, and Chinese authorities imposed movement and business restrictions in those areas. However, these restrictions have also since generally been eased, but the key point to highlight here is that while restrictions are generally easing, Chinese authorities will also reimpose them on the local level when necessary. I say restrictions are generally easing. It's important to keep in mind, though, in terms of international travel, Chinese authorities have actually ratcheted up international movement restrictions. Foreign nationals are effectively banned from entering the country since late March. And another, at this point, fairly unique response that China has had is imposing large-scale movement and contact tracking. Basically, Chinese authorities are requiring people to install a mini program, usually on WeChat, a very common Chinese mobile app on their phones, which assesses people a color-coded green, yellow, or red health threat assessment. So people with a green code are generally allowed to move between cities as they need to or desire. A yellow code generally requires people to stay in the city that they are currently in, and a red code would require people to self-isolate for at least 14 days. Chinese authorities, the way these apps work are they basically keep track of where people have been and who they have had close contact with. Something to keep in mind here is that there are unique features of China's experience with COVID-19 and its response to the outbreak, meaning that China's experience here cannot necessarily be applied to other countries. And that's true also for the other countries that we're going to examine later. In terms of the outlook in China, it's likely that China will maintain its dynamic of incremental normalization, basically generally easing gathering and business restrictions, but reimposing them where necessary, and relying primarily on its extensive movement tracking to keep track of the virus and control outbreaks where necessary. Um, International travel restrictions are highly likely to be maintained for the time being, although some degree of easing is of course possible. Then looking at broader, economic disruptions related to the outbreak. Obviously, China was the first hit and it imposed some of the severest restrictions of anywhere that we've seen in the world. This has caused fairly deep disruptions to normal economic activity in China. So that's something we definitely want to keep an eye on going forward in terms of potential knockoff effects. Moving on to South Korea. South Korea also is under a broadly defined incremental normalization dynamic right now. However, its approach was quite different when compared to that of China. South Korea generally adopted a testing-focused approach as opposed to severe domestic movement restrictions. South Korean authorities have generally dealt with the outbreak by having a high degree of testing capacity and then using that to do contact testing on known cases. Of course, there have also been some domestic movement, business and gathering restrictions, school closures, etc. And also now South Korea is imposing mandatory quarantines on most people arriving in the country. South Korea's very proactive testing focused approach has had a high degree of apparent success with fairly low infection rates in terms of confirmed cases per million people, and also in terms of the death rates, which are quite low compared to a global average, especially considering that South Korea was one of the earlier countries to get hit with sustained community transmission. What we've seen regionally is that many other Asia Pacific countries, notably New Zealand and Australia, I'd say have tried to emulate South Korea's testing focused response with some degree of success. But those countries have also generally had more stringent international movement restrictions than South Korea. Moving on to talk about the outlook in South Korea. Highly likely that South Korea will maintain its incremental normalization approach if no major outbreaks occur. A quick note, as of today, there were no confirmed domestic transmission cases in South Korea, which is a fairly reliable statistic since South Korean authorities have been so proactive in terms of testing. South Korea, again, is likely to continue its contact testing focused approach. And of course, it will have economic impacts. So far, these have been less severe than in China because the outbreak hasn't been so widespread there, and the control measures haven't been so draconian. But it's important to keep in mind that South Korea is even more dependent on international trade than China itself for its economy. So, economic uncertainty and various knockoff effects related to that are highly likely in South Korea going forward. Moving on to another important Northeast Asian country, Japan. Generally, in recent weeks, Japan has kind of shifted from a business first to a health first approach. Japan has been fairly late in terms of imposing controls to prevent the spread of the virus. There's possibly a degree of political motivation at play there because Japan's response has been notably more proactive following the cancellation of the 2020, or I should say more accurately, postponement of the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. Many observers believe that the Japanese government was basically downplaying the outbreak in order to hope that the Olympics would go forward as planned. But after they were canceled, there has been a notable increase in control measures within the country. These control measures, though, I would say have been fairly lax, even when compared to, say, South Korea, in that whatever restrictions are imposed do not carry criminal penalties. Japan has also had generally insufficient testing capacity, as you can see in this little chart here of tests per million people. Both Singapore and Australia, also APAC countries, fairly prosperous, like Japan itself is, have over 20,000 tests per million people, whereas Japan is still at around 1,200 or so. Moving on to the outlook in Japan, it's generally likely at this point that an increase in cases in the country will cement Japan's shift from the business first model to the health first approach. There have been generally increasing numbers of confirmed cases in Japan in recent weeks. At the same time, it's possible that those numbers might be some underreported due to generally insufficient testing capacity. So at this point, it's generally likely that as the virus spreads in Japan, more control measures will be introduced. And it's also important to note, like essentially every large economy or every economy in the world right now, there will be knock-off macroeconomic effects in Japan. And notably in Japan, they were having significant economic problems from the last quarter of 2019 before this virus even had any major regional economic impact. Moving on to India's response. India reacted fairly quickly to the virus in terms of screening passengers from mainland China and then expanding those screening measures to other locations at their international airports from around February. But in terms of domestic controls, those only really began around March. Generally in India, there hasn't been sufficient testing capacity, but again, the government has reacted fairly proactively, especially since mid-March. Right now, India is it's reassessing its control measures. Obviously, conditions in India vary significantly from state to state and from rural areas to urban areas. So what we've seen is testing capacity and control measures, government response has varied significantly by region, but generally controls are starting to ease in most major areas at this time. Moving on to the outlook in India, it's generally likely that existing interstate transport restrictions will be lifted, especially in parts of the country such as the far northeast and in parts of southern India where newly confirmed cases are decreasing. However, it's important to keep in mind, generally we can define India as an incremental normalization approach, largely because control measures were quite stringent before and are generally being eased out. But this varies significantly from location to location. Many parts of the country, including most major cities, have been designated as official containment zones, um, which is basically the government imposing a radius around communities that have had significant numbers of confirmed cases and having more stringent movement controls, specifically in those areas. Um, Obviously, there are many concerns in terms of the economic and business outlook, both in terms of the effect of movement controls and their various knockoff effects, but also as business restrictions are generally lifted, it's of course not impossible that cases may subsequently increase, and that governments at the national level or at the state level may modify their approach to the outbreaks. Moving on to Singapore's response. Singapore was once generally held up as a fairly model approach to the COVID-19 outbreak. Again, it was a country that was like South Korea. It had community transmission fairly early when compared to most global locations. And obviously Singapore is a city-state. It's small, it's prosperous. The government tends to be efficient and effective. So they've been um, if you look at in terms of per capita testing, the response has been fairly robust, and they, for the most part, avoided most domestic movement controls while increasing international movement controls until recent weeks. What has happened recently is that there have been significant new cases in migrant worker dormitories. Singapore has a large class of people from other countries doing manual labor such as construction, who are often housed in crowded conditions, and there have been significant outbreaks in many of those housing units in recent weeks. In response to that, Singapore has generally um, increased its domestic gathering and business restrictions, with the more stringent responses and measures scheduled to remain in place through June 1st. Moving on to the outlook in Singapore, Singapore is likely to maintain its health first approach to the crisis through at least through June 1st. However, if the country has success in terms of controlling its known outbreaks, it's likely to shift to a more incremental normalization approach after June 1st. The final country we want to look at specifically is Indonesia. Indonesia is obviously a huge, very populous Southeastern Asian country. And we've seen an interesting approach to its reaction. Indonesia has been very late in terms of responding to the virus. But we have seen a recent shift just over, I would say roughly the past week or so, from a business first model to a health first model. We have to keep in mind that there may be various political motivations to its somewhat delayed response in terms of not wanting to disrupt economic activity, and also there are some pre-existing tensions between the central government and various provincial governments. I mentioned that control measures have been have been introduced within approximately the last week or so. This is generally in response not only to the increase in cases, but also the Ramadan travel period in Indonesia. Ramadan began just a few days ago, and that's a very important travel period in Indonesia, wherein many people return to their hometowns from urban areas. The government was very concerned about this yearly migration spreading the outbreak to additional areas. So control measures have been more stringent within around the last week. But of course, as you can see from this chart, Indonesia has lagged behind in terms of testing per capita. Indonesia is a very populous country. and it's not prosperous generally when compared to other global economies in terms of per capita income. However, even when compared to, say, the Philippines, which might be, generally analogous in terms of its economic situation, Indonesia has lagged behind in terms of its testing capabilities. Moving on to the outlook in Indonesia, again, it's fairly likely that the likely increase in cases may cement its shift to a health first approach. As I mentioned earlier, we have to examine potential spread of the disease due to the Ramadan travel period. And Indonesian authorities are likely to at least continue the control measures that they currently have in place until they have a better handle on the situation. Something to keep in mind in Indonesia and in many countries, both regionally and potentially around the world, is that, as the control measures, the economic disruptions, all of these factors might lead to a degree of political instability and potentially protests in some locations. Speaking generally about region-wide concerns, I mentioned earlier the Ramadan travel period in Indonesia. Obviously, that would be a factor in other regional Muslim majority countries like, say, Malaysia, were it not for the fact that Malaysia has a very stringent movement controls in place right now. Something else to keep in mind, though, is that early May is a very important holiday and travel period in China, in South Korea, and in Japan. So it's possible that there may be new spread of outbreaks, and then in response, perhaps newly imposed, at least localized control measures in response to those potential outbreaks. Just in general, there's a lot of uncertainty. Even in countries that have apparently had successes in terms of containing new spread, there's a lot about this virus that we still don't know in terms of potential resurgence, maybe in the fall, and of course, various government responses. Essentially, many governments, if you look at in terms of international travel restrictions, um, governments can't, even if they have had some successes or a high degree of success, they don't necessarily trust the responses in other governments, which is, of course, the biggest factor in terms of countries essentially banning inbound international travel. In terms of general implications for business, as I mentioned, given this lack of distrust or doubt between various national level governments, international travel restrictions or mandatory quarantine measures, etc., are highly likely to continue over the coming weeks and likely months. There's also, of course, general business continuity concerns, especially for industries like hospitality, hotels, airlines, and anything related to travel and leisure. But of course, also concerns about industrial production. We've seen gathering restrictions and, of course, just reduced consumer demand, causing some fairly widespread systematic production disruptions in many APAC countries. And of course, we have to keep in mind that supply chains are global and interconnected in often very complicated ways. While factories have generally resumed operations in production in China, it's possible that they are reliant on components that come from Japan, and possibly there will be disruptions in the places in Japan that those Chinese companies rely on. What we've also seen, of course, is many, say, clothing factories in Bangladesh, Myanmar, and Cambodia, and Vietnam. They're reliant on inputs from China, which were disrupted until recently, but all of these problems, all of these inefficiencies within global supply chains take a long time to resolve. So there are likely to be disruptions for a significant period of time going forward.